The day I walked into my father's restaurant wearing my district manager badge, he introduced me to his business partners as my daughter. She works in retail, not as the person who had just been promoted to oversee 43 stores across Ontario, not as the woman who had spent 6 years rebuilding her career from a part-time cashier position after her marriage collapsed. Just my daughter, she works in retail. The way you'd mention someone who bags groceries on weekends. I smiled. I always smiled. That was something my mother understood about me that my father never did. She'd watch me smile through his dismissals the way you watch someone hold their breath underwater. Impressed, worried, waiting for the moment they'd have to come up for air. My father built his whole world around appearances. He owned a Portuguese-style catering business in Mississauga, the kind of place that did wedding receptions and corporate luncheons, and he carried himself like a man who had personally invented the concept of hard work. He was proud of what he'd built, and he had every right to be. He'd come to Canada from Portugal in his late 20s with almost nothing, and he'd created something real. I don't want to take that away from him, but somewhere along the way, the pride he had in himself curdled into something else, a need to be the most impressive person in any room, and a quiet resentment toward anyone who threatened that, including his own children. My brother Oliver could do no wrong. Oliver, who had dropped out of his business administration program twice, who had borrowed money from my father 3 separate times and never paid it back, who had once crashed the catering van into a parking garage pillar and told my father it was a hit and run. Oliver walked through life with the easy confidence of someone who has never once had to prove himself, because he never had to. The proof was automatic. He was a son. I was something else. I don't want to frame this as a simple story about a father who preferred his son. It was more complicated than that, and I think the honest version is more useful than the clean one. My father loved me. I believe that genuinely. But his love came with a ceiling. There was a height he had decided, somewhere in the back of his mind, that was appropriate for me to reach, and anything beyond that ceiling made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate and therefore expressed as dismissal. When I got my first management promotion at 28, he asked if it came with benefits. When I told him yes, extended health and dental, he nodded and said that was good, that was practical. When Oliver got a sales role at a car dealership the same year, my father took the whole family out to dinner at a steakhouse in Burlington to celebrate. I told myself it didn't matter. I was very good at telling myself things didn't matter. My mother, on the other hand, had always seen me clearly. She was a quiet woman, not passive. There's a difference. The kind of person who chose her words carefully because she understood that words, once released, don't come back. She had watched my father for 38 years with the particular clarity that comes from proximity. She knew exactly who he was. She loved him anyway, which is its own kind of complicated, but she had never once let his blind spots become her blind spots. When I called her the night I got the district manager offer, she was the first person I told. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Metrolinx building in downtown Toronto, still in my interview blazer, hands shaking slightly, and I called her before I even called my best friend. I knew, she said. Just that, I knew. You couldn't have known, I said. I didn't even know. I knew, she said again, and I could hear her smiling through the phone. I didn't tell my father that night. I waited until I had the offer letter in writing, until the start date was confirmed, until I had my new business cards in my hands. Some part of me understood that I needed the physical proof before I walked into that conversation, because I had learned, slowly and painfully, that my father could talk me out of my own certainty if I gave him the opening. When I finally told him, we were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. My mother had made caldo verde, which she always made when she sensed something significant was about to happen, like she was salting the ground before a storm. My father was at the head of the table talking about a corporate contract he'd just landed for a pharmaceutical company's annual gala, and I waited for a pause and said, as evenly as I could manage, that I had some news. I got promoted to district manager, I said. I'll be overseeing 43 stores across Ontario. It's a significant jump. My father looked at me for a moment, then he said, that's a lot of driving. My mother looked at her soup bowl. Oliver, to his credit, said congratulations. I think he meant it. My father went back to talking about the pharmaceutical gala. I sat there and finished my caldo verde and told myself it didn't matter. The thing about carrying something like that for years is that it doesn't stay in one place, it moves around. Some days it sat in my chest like a stone, this grief for a version of my father who saw me. Other days it turned into something harder, something I wasn't as comfortable naming. I threw myself into work because work was the one arena where the rules were clear. You performed, you were measured, you advanced. No one could look at a quarterly report and decide it didn't count because of who had produced it. I was good at my job. Not in a quiet, careful way, in a real way, the kind of good that gets noticed. Within 18 months of the district manager promotion, I was being talked about at the regional director level. My VP, a woman named Susan, who had built her career through the kind of methodical excellence that makes other people nervous, called me into her office one afternoon and told me, without preamble, that the company was expanding into the Quebec market and they were looking at me to lead the pilot. I asked her to give me the weekend to think about it. She said, "Take Monday too. But I need an answer by Tuesday because we're moving on this regardless." I didn't tell my father right away. I had stopped doing that, the telling my father things reflex that had persisted embarrassingly far into my adulthood. Instead, I called my mother, who already knew because she always already knew. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "I'm scared." "That's how you know it's real," she said. I took it. The Quebec pilot was 18 months of the hardest work I had ever done. I was commuting between Mississauga and Montreal on a semi-regular basis, managing a team of people who were, rightfully, skeptical of an Anglophone from Ontario arriving to expand a retail chain into their market. I learned. I made mistakes. I had one regional supervisor who quit in the first month and left me a voice message that I listened to approximately 4 times in a parking lot in Laval, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. And then I went home and fixed the things that needed fixing and did not go wrong in those ways again. By the end of the pilot, we had exceeded our first-year targets by 22%. The Quebec expansion was greenlit for full rollout. I was promoted to regional vice president. I was 34 years old. I flew back from Montreal on a Friday evening, and my mother picked me up from Pearson because she had insisted, and I had learned to stop arguing with her insistence. She was waiting at arrivals in her winter coat, the gray one she'd had for 15 years that she refused to replace because it still worked perfectly fine. And when she saw me, she just held out her arms and I walked into them and stood there for a moment longer than I probably should have in the middle of a busy terminal. "Regional Vice President," she said into my hair. "Regional Vice President," I confirmed. She pulled back and looked at my face. "Are you happy?" "I think I will be," I said. "Once I sleep for about 14 hours. She laughed and took one of my bags without asking, and we walked to the parking structure together, and she told me about the garden and what was happening with the neighbors and a documentary she'd been watching about ocean ecosystems, and I let all of it wash over me because it was exactly what I needed. I saw my father at their house the following Sunday. He was in the garage when I arrived, doing something with the shelving units he'd been reorganizing for approximately 3 years. My mother let me in and gave me coffee and we sat in the kitchen, and when my father came inside, he looked at me the way he always looked at me, with a warmth that had an asterisk attached to it, and asked how things were going. "Good," I said. "I got promoted again." He washed his hands at the kitchen sink. "To what?" "Regional Vice President, Quebec and expansion." He dried his hands on the dish towel. "Quebec's a different market," he said. "The language alone." "I managed it," I said. He said again, and poured himself coffee, and that was the end of the conversation. My mother looked at me over the rim of her mug. I looked back at her. We had a whole conversation in that look, the two of us, and none of it needed words. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday in April. I know it was a Tuesday because I remember being annoyed about it. I had a vendor call that afternoon that I'd been trying to schedule for 3 weeks, and instead I was on the DVP in crawling traffic because my father had called my mother in a panic about the catering van's transmission, and she had called me because Oliver was, apparently, unreachable, which was the most Oliver thing Oliver had ever done. My father's catering business operated out of a commercial kitchen space he rented in an industrial area near the airport. He had a van for equipment transport and a separate vehicle for himself. The van's transmission had apparently decided that Tuesday was its last day on Earth, and my father had pulled it into a lot near Pearson and was waiting for a tow. And my mother needed me to go get him because she didn't drive on the highway. I called the vendor and rescheduled. I got off the DVP at the next exit and made my way to the address my mother had texted me. It was the kind of April morning that can't decide what it wants to be. Overcast but bright, cold but not cold enough to justify the coat I'd grabbed on my way out. The parking lot my father had pulled into was adjacent to one of the airport hotels, a large corporate property, the kind that hosts conferences and product launches and end-of-year galas. When I pulled in, I saw my father standing beside the van, arms crossed, looking at it the way you look at something that has betrayed you. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and he was nodding in that impatient way he had that communicated he was only partially listening to whoever he was talking to. I parked and got out and walked toward him. He saw me and raised a hand, the universal signal for wait a minute, and kept talking on the phone. I stood near the van and looked at the transmission, which was not something I knew anything about, and waited. That's when I noticed the other vehicles in the lot. There were two of them, black, polished, the kind of clean that doesn't happen by accident. They were parked near the hotel's side entrance, and standing beside them were two people in dark suits. Not hotel staff. Something else. I recognized the vehicles before I recognized why I recognized them. My company had recently signed a partnership with a national retail development group, and part of that partnership involved a joint summit. A 2-day conference that I knew, because I had been CC'd on approximately 40 emails about it, was being held at an airport hotel this week. The senior executives from the development group were flying in from Vancouver, and arrangements had been made for their ground transportation. I stood very still for a moment. My father ended his call and came to stand beside me looking at the black vehicles with an expression I recognized. The expression he got when he saw something he associated with power and success. He got it at galas. He got it when certain clients came to talk to him in his good suit. He got it, I realized with a small, tired ache, in a way he never got around me. Corporate people? He said, nodding toward the vehicles. Hotel must have someone important coming in. Probably, I said. One of the suited figures near the car was looking in our direction. I recognized him. Marcus from the development group's operations team, who had been on 3 video calls with me in the past 2 months. He raised a hand. I raised mine back. My father noticed. You know him? We've worked together, I said. My father's expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read, recalibrating maybe. Trying to fit this new information into the existing framework. Marcus was walking toward us now, and beside him woman I hadn't expected. Andrea Gallagher, the CEO of the development group, who I knew primarily from her emails, which were always 4 sentences long and extremely direct. She was in her early 60s, the kind of woman who had spent in any room and had stopped performing anything about it 30 years ago. Simone, Marcus said when he reached us. Didn't realize you'd be here. Logistics, I said. My father's van. We just landed 20 minutes ago, Marcus said. We're heading in for the preliminary session. He turned to my father and extended a hand. Marcus Webb. I work with your daughter. My father shook his hand. Paulo, he said, Simone's father. He said it the way he always said it, with the particular possessiveness of a man who was used to being the introduction. Andrea Gallagher had stepped forward. She was looking at me with an expression that was entirely business, which I had come to understand was her warmest register. Miss Ferreira, she said, I've been looking forward to this summit. Your team's regional numbers are remarkable. My father went very quiet beside me. Thank you, I said. The Quebec team did the heavy lifting. I just tried not to get in their way. She smiled at that. A small, genuine thing. That's the answer I always hope to hear. We'll talk properly tomorrow. She looked at my father briefly, politely, the way you acknowledge someone you don't need to know, and then she looked back at me. Bring those Q1 projections. I want to go through them before the full session. Already printed, I said. She nodded good. She touched Marcus's arm briefly and they turned toward the hotel entrance. I stood in the parking lot beside my father and the broken van in the April light and did not look at him. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, who was that? Andrea Gallagher, I said. She runs the development group we're partnering with. Another silence. She knows your numbers, he said. It wasn't a question. She makes it her business to know numbers, I said. The tow truck arrived 9 minutes later, which I know because I counted. My father supervised the loading of the van with the same precise attention he always gave to physical tasks, and I stood nearby and answered emails on my phone, and we did not talk about Andrea Gallagher or Q1 projections or Quebec. I drove him home afterward because that was the plan. We sat in my car on the 427 in the kind of quiet that has texture to it. He asked, somewhere around Dixie Road, how long the Quebec project had been going on. About 2 years, I said. And this summit, he said. It's important? Yes, it's a significant partnership. And you're leading it. I'm one of the leads, yes. He looked out the window at the highway. I didn't know, he said finally. I kept my eyes on the road. The thing is, I knew what he meant. He didn't mean he hadn't known about the summit, or the promotion, or the Quebec expansion. I had told him these things. He meant something else, something that required him to admit that the information had existed, and he had simply not allowed it to land. that the ceiling he'd built had kept things out as well as in. I had imagined this moment many times, in the various ways you imagine conversations that haven't happened yet. In some versions I said things that were perfectly calibrated. Honest but not cruel, clear but not cutting. In other versions I said nothing at all. In one version that I'm not proud of, I said everything I'd accumulated over 34 years and watched it land and felt nothing like the relief I'd expected. What I actually said was, "I know." He turned from the window and looked at me. "I know you didn't know," I said. "And I think the more honest thing is to say that I'm not sure it would have changed much if you had. You heard the things I told you. He was quiet for a long moment. We passed the Caledonia Road exit. Somewhere a transport truck was changing lanes. "I was proud of Oliver," he said. "I thought that was what fathers were supposed to do, make their sons into men." "You have a daughter," I said. Not angrily, just as a fact. "I know. I needed you to make me into myself," I said. "Not into something smaller." He made a sound that I can only describe as a man setting down something heavy. Not a sigh exactly. Something more involuntary than that. I took the exit toward their neighborhood and we drove the last 5 minutes without talking. And when I pulled into the driveway, my mother was already at the front door, watching us the way she always watched us when we'd been in the same space for longer than usual. With an attention that was equal parts love and held breath. My father got out of the car and went inside. And my mother came down the front steps and stood beside my open window. "Okay," she said. I said. She looked at my face for a moment. "You said something." "I said something," I confirmed. She nodded slowly. "Good," she said. And then, after a pause, "Are you coming in?" I thought about it. "Not today," I said. "I have that vendor call." She squeezed my hand through the window. "Sunday," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sunday," I said. I backed out of the driveway and drove home along residential streets, past the schools and the Tim Hortons, and the identical subdivisions that had been going up in waves since I was a child, and I thought about the look on my father's face when Andrea Gallagher said your team's regional numbers are remarkable. The particular quality of his silence. The way the information had arrived at a frequency he could finally hear. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think the triumphant version is the easier story to tell. And I'm not sure it's the true one. What I felt was something quieter, a loosening, maybe. The particular relief of a thing that has been waiting a long time to be said finally being said, not to punish anyone, but because it was simply true, and truth has its own weight. My mother had known this about me from the beginning, that I didn't need my father's recognition to be who I was. I had built that in other ways, in the long accumulation of decisions made alone, and work done without an audience and small victories claimed in empty parking lots with shaking hands. But there is a difference between not needing something and not having wanted it. And I had wanted it for a long time, and I think it's allowed to say that. It doesn't diminish the life I built to admit that I built it partly around a wound. My father called me the following Thursday, not Sunday, Thursday, which was unusual enough that I let it go to voicemail and listened to it afterward in my office. He said he'd been thinking. He said he wanted to hear more about the Quebec project, if I was willing to tell him. He said he had a catering event near my office the following week, and wondered if we could get lunch. He didn't apologize, exactly. My father is not a man who does that easily, and I had long since stopped needing it in the form I'd expected when I was younger. What he did was open a door, and I had enough of my mother in me to understand the difference between a door and a statement. I texted him back that evening, "Lunch works. Let me know when your event is confirmed." He replied with a thumbs up emoji, which is the most emotionally articulate thing I have ever received from him. My mother, when I told her, made the sound she makes when she already knew something and is simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. I'm not going to tell you that everything changed after that day in the parking lot. It didn't, not all at once. My father is who he is and I am who I am, and the distance between who we are has not disappeared. But there are conversations now that weren't possible before, practical, careful conversations, the kind where someone is trying, even imperfectly, and where trying means something. Last month, he called to tell me that a woman he knows from his catering network had a daughter starting out in retail management, and could he pass along my number? "She's sharp," he said. "Like you were. Like you were." I turned that phrase over for a while after we hung up. The past tense bothered me, and then I decided it didn't, and then I decided the truth was somewhere between those two things. He was trying to say I was sharp. He reached for the wrong tense and landed somewhere adjacent to a compliment, which is for my father a significant journey. I texted the woman's daughter that evening. She called me the next morning, full of questions, the kind of call I would have killed for at 26. I talked to her for 45 minutes in my car before work, in a parking lot, with the engine running. I told her the things my mother would have told me if she'd been in that world. I told her to take up the space that was offered and then take a little more. I told her that there would be people who had decided in advance how much room she was allowed, and that this was information about them, not about her. I told her that the work would be its own kind of answer, and that was the truest thing I knew.